Just a couple of quick announcements before we get going here. Number one is your exams have been graded. By and large, this exam went pretty well. I believe the average on it was probably around a 90, like an 87-ish percent range. So that was really good. So very impressed with that. The other thing is that in 2 weeks, we're going to have our final exam. So I'll go ahead and just kind of write a couple of things about the final here. So the final exam will be 2 weeks from today on May 19th. So it'll be all multiple choice, just like normal. It will be a total of 75 questions. Now, of those 75 questions, 40 are going to be coming from the new stuff. So 40 are going to be coming from chapter 11 and 19, which is going to be the last chapter we cover. And then the other 35 questions or so will come directly from the previous exams. So that'll be all from the previous material, but they will come from the previous exams. So I'll just put chapters 1 through 9. Okay. So what I will do today is I'm going to upload the key for exam 1 because we did that one in person. Exam 2 and exam 3, I'll unlock those on Canvas, and I'll also put up a Word document version of each of those as well, so that way you can use those to study for the old questions. Okay, for those 35 questions. Okay. Questions 40, or the 40 questions are going to come from chapters 11 through 19. That will be this week's material and next week's material. There is a final exam kind of practice sheet that is up on Canvas as well. I'll show you that at the end of the day, or at the end of our lecture here. So you can use that to study as well to kind of determine what you'll need to learn or what you need to pay attention to for the new material. So this week we'll have our last homework assignment. That'll be due this upcoming Tuesday, so a week from today. And that is pretty much it. We'll just have this week's lab and next week's lab, and it'll be a wrap after that. Cool. Any questions on anything that's coming up before we go forward here? Any questions at all? Okay, cool. Okay, so I'll be kind of giving reminders every day for the next 2 weeks. So yeah, if you have any questions about what's coming up or what's going on with the final, let me know. It'll be pretty much the same format as it's always been, and it'll go from 8 a.m. in the morning to 11:59 p.m. just like normal. So nothing new that's going to be thrown at you, okay, except for those chapter 11 and chapter 19 questions. Okay. So if there's no questions, we'll go ahead and jump forward here. And so this week and next week, our last kind of unit here is going to be where we're going to be looking at populations as a whole. Okay, so if you remember, so far we've pretty much been looking at individuals, individual organisms, but today we're going to be looking at how populations can change in terms of the kind of the build of the populations, how it's structured, how each of the species is going to be evolving. And then next week, we're going to be looking at how population sizes can change and how we can study population sizes. Okay. So we're really going to be looking at population dynamics over the next 2 weeks to wrap up our semester. Okay. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at how populations can change in terms of the species structure and how we can have different species and how different populations can change over a period of time. Okay. So that's going to be our game plan for today. This is going to be a study of what's called evolutionary biology. And so evolutionary biology was kind of founded by a couple guys, Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace. And so what's kind of interesting about these two scientists is that they were actually kind of traveling the world to try to identify, how different species look the same and how certain species look different. And how is it that some species can look related to another species, but other ones have very distinct differences between the two? Okay. And so they were actually going around the world independently of each other. They had no idea the other one was also studying the same thing that they were. They had no idea that the other one even existed. And so they were going around the world looking at all different types of populations and trying to understand how populations of certain species can look different from other species. Okay. And so pretty much from 1831 to 1836, Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace were both kind of circling the world. Darwin specifically went around South America, Australia, and then Africa, looking at all kinds of different species, and then eventually settled at the Galapagos Islands. And so when he reached the Galapagos Islands, he started to look at specifically some ground finch species, so the species of the ground finch birds. And what he noticed is that a lot of the species there, in addition to the finches, looked very similar to one another. Okay, a lot of the species looked very similar, but they had some distinct differences between them that made them completely different. So he was trying to wonder, or he's trying to determine, why is it that these specific birds, or why are these specific species look similar in some traits, but completely different, and still become different overall species. Okay. And so when he was looking at the Galapagos finches, he started to look at their beak sizes. Okay, and so what he saw was that their beak sizes came in all different sizes and all different shapes. And so, as we saw in lab last week, the finch beak sizes was the result of the different types of foods that they were eating. Okay? The different types of foods that were available and what their beaks would allow them to eat. Okay? Now, in doing so, he saw that some had very big beaks, some had very small beaks, some had very long beaks, some had very short beaks, and kind of everything in between. And so he was trying to figure out, okay, why is it that this is happening? Why is it that all these finches kind of look similar, but their beak sizes are significantly different from one another? Okay? And so he determined that the finch species all were modified from one original mainland finch species. Okay? So basically what happened is there was one overall mainland finch, one finch that was on the overall mainland, okay, one species of finch. Okay? And as it started to go to all the individual Galapagos Islands, okay, they were all being exposed to different environments. Okay? And so as a result, they all started to develop their own individual traits, their own beak sizes and beak shapes, and then ultimately ended up becoming individual beak species, okay, or individual finch species, okay, that were separate from all of the other ones. And so again, Darwin and Wallace were trying to figure out why exactly they were starting to develop all these different beak sizes and beak shapes. And with other species, other organisms, why is it that they were able to develop the way they did? Okay, why are they different, or why are species slightly different from one another? And they eventually settled on the idea of natural selection. And what's kind of interesting is that Darwin and Wallace both came up with natural selection at about the same time. Okay? But again, they had no idea that the other one even existed and that the other one was even working on the same topic. But they both came up with natural selection at around the same time point. Okay? And so when we see natural selection, and this is probably something you've heard of, in like introductory biology in high school, is natural selection is usually defined as survival of the fittest. Okay? That's a pretty good definition, but it's not a fully complete definition. Natural selection has to do with organisms being able to survive best, okay, based on the traits that they have. Okay? Those individual traits are going to determine how well that particular organism is going to be able to survive in that environment. Okay? So some organisms are going to have traits that allow them to survive best in that environment. So those are going to be the ones that are able to survive and eventually reproduce. Okay? Other ones that don't have the traits that are able to allow them to survive as well are not going to survive as well. Okay? And they're not going to be able to reproduce. Okay? So natural selection has to do with the individuals in the population, the traits that they have, and if those traits allow them to survive better. Okay? If they're able to survive better, okay, obviously they'll survive and then have a chance to reproduce and pass those genes into the next generation. Okay? So natural selection is something that acts on individuals. Okay? Natural selection acts on individuals in the population. Okay? And so Darwin will kind of publish his findings in a book called On the Origin of Species. This is something you can actually find pretty readily. Okay, so that's natural selection. Okay, does natural selection make sense so far? And we'll kind of develop this into a little bit further as we go on here. Any questions so far? This is just kind of the intro to where we're going here. Okay. All right, so with natural selection is based off of 3 overall principles, and all 3 of these have to be true in order for us to see natural selection in action. Okay? The first principle is that an organism's characteristics need to be inherited from their parents. Okay? So for example, if we're looking at individual traits that an organism has, those traits have to be inherited, okay, from their parents. They cannot just be traits that they just develop because of their diet. Diet really isn't going to have as much to do with natural selection as genetics will. Okay? So individual traits have to be inherited from parent to offspring. Okay? That's number 1. Number 2 is that more offspring have to be produced in that particular population, okay, than are actually able to survive. And that is going to be due to the amount of resources available. Okay? Resources are always going to be very limited. Okay? And so if you're producing much more organisms than the environment is able to sustain, or that the resources available are able to sustain, that is going to result in competition for those particular resources. Okay? So the organisms that are able to get access to those resources are the ones that will survive. The ones that are able to outcompete the others will be able to survive. The ones that are not able to outcompete the other organisms will not be able to survive. But more offspring are going to be produced that are going to be able to survive. And again, that's going to be due to limited resources available. Okay. If you're able to access those resources, that's going to allow you to be able to survive and reproduce. Okay. That's number 2. Okay. The third principle is that all the offspring that get produced from a set of parents and then multiple other sets of offspring, they all have to be different from each other. So they're all going to have different types of characteristics and different variations. So for example, even though we have a one mother or one father here, okay, one father rabbit, one mother rabbit, the offspring that they produce are all going to look very different. Okay? So that's what we call variations. Okay, variation in their characteristics. Okay? So offspring have to be variable, or they have to vary in the characteristics that they have. And again, those characteristics are going to help to determine which ones are able to survive and reproduce. Okay. So those are the 3 principles that are necessary for natural selection to take place. Okay. So we need traits that can be inherited from parent to offspring. We need more offspring that are being produced and are actually able to survive, okay, based on the amount of resources available. And then number 3, we need to be looking at offspring that are able to vary in the traits that they have. Okay, that's that. Okay, so all of that being said, Darwin took all those 3 principles and then kind of compiled that into one kind of overall explanation for how natural selection works. Okay? And so essentially what happens is offspring that have characteristics that allow them to survive and compete for those limited resources, okay, are going to be the ones that are able to survive, okay, compared to the ones that don't have those favorable traits. Okay? So for example, here we have a giraffe that's got a long neck, we've got a giraffe that's got a medium neck, and then a giraffe that's got a short neck. Okay? The resources are going to be this food, these leaves up in this tree. Okay? So our long neck giraffes are going to be able to access these resources because the neck is long enough to allow it to be able to reach those trees. Okay? However, the medium neck giraffe and the short neck giraffe are not going to be able to access those resources. They're too short. They're not going to be able to actually access that food. Okay? And so as a result, we consider this long neck trait to be a favorable trait because it allows them to be able to get those resources, while the medium and short neck giraffes, those are non-favorable traits or less favorable. Okay? So that being said, the ones that are able to, actually, let me ask you guys, based off of what we see here, which of these giraffes is going to be able to survive better? Okay, is it going to be the long neck giraffes, the medium neck giraffes, or the short neck giraffes? Which ones will survive better? Okay. What do we think? Right, the long neck giraffes, right? So the long neck giraffes are going to be the ones that are surviving better, so they're going to be able to produce or access those resources. Okay. The medium and short neck giraffes, they're not going to be able to survive because they can't reach their food. So if they're not able to survive, okay, they're not going to be able to survive long enough to have a chance to reproduce. So the medium and short neck genes are going to get eliminated from the population, because these guys are not going to have a chance to reproduce at all. Okay. On the other hand, the long-necked giraffes, because they have long necks, they're able to survive. Okay. Those are going to pass on their long neck genes to the rest of their generation, or to the rest of their offspring. Okay. And then it's going to continue to propagate from generation to generation. Okay. And so what we see here is that instead of having a population that's got long, medium, and short-necked giraffes, we're going to end up with having multiple generations of mostly long-necked giraffes, because these are going to be the ones that are best able to survive and eventually reproduce. Okay? So natural selection is not just its ability to survive, but its ability to also reproduce too. Okay? It doesn't do you any good to survive if you're not able to reproduce as well. Okay? So this is what we call descent with modification. Okay? Descent meaning going from one generation to the next, while the particular traits are able to be modified in order to best fit that particular environment. Okay. So that's typically how natural selection will work. Okay. Passing on the most, or surviving, and then eventually passing on those favorable traits into the next generation, okay? Assuming those traits allow you to survive and reproduce. Okay. So here's another example. So here we're looking at some green beetles and some brown beetles. Okay? And so we got some birds here that are going to be the predators. So the brown beetles are able to camouflage a little bit better in their environment, while the green beetles stick out more. Okay? And so the birds are able to eat the green beetles. Okay? So if the green beetles continue to die, and then eventually we're going to see more brown beetles taking over more of our population, until eventually we have a full population that's made up of just brown beetles. Okay? And so the brown beetles, like I said, are able to camouflage. Their brown color allows them to survive better and eventually reproduce. The green beetles, because they stick out like a sore thumb to these birds, are not going to be able to survive, and as a result, they're not going to be able to reproduce. Okay? So that's what we consider the green beetles having been considered selected against, okay, meaning that natural selection has worked against them, while the brown beetles have flourished. They've been able to survive and reproduce. Okay. Before we go forward, does this make sense? Okay, if it makes sense, go ahead and throw a star or a check mark or something. Let me know if this makes sense. Or if there's any questions, let me know. All right. Okay, cool. All righty, cool. All right, so that's how natural selection typically works. Now, the thing about natural selection is that it usually needs to be seen, if we're going to see natural selection occur, it's going to happen over a very long period of time. It takes a long time for us to actually see the effects of natural selection in a substantial way for us to be able to know that it's actually occurring. Okay? We know that it does occur, but if we want to observe it, it usually takes years and years and years to actually see the effects of it. Luckily, there was these two scientists named Peter and Rosemary Grant, and so they kind of picked up on Darwin's studies in the 1970s, and they wanted to look at the medium ground finches on Daphne major. Okay? And so what's really cool about these two people is that they were actually able to see natural selection occur in a very, very short time span. So they got to Daphne major, which is one of the islands on the Galapagos, and they were actually able to see natural selection a few times over, just a small, I think maybe a 3 to 5 year period. Okay? And so what they did was they wanted to kind of, again, pick up on what Darwin was studying and look at the beak sizes of the medium ground finch on Daphne major. Okay. So when we're looking at the medium ground finches, and we should have seen these in the videos from last week in lab, these medium ground finches are going to be eating some seeds. Okay? So there's going to be some small soft seeds and then some large, pretty hard seeds. Okay? But that's going to be the main food source for the medium ground finch on Daphne major. Okay? And so the size of the beak is going to determine what that particular finch is going to be able to eat. Okay? So before we go forward here, kind of using our kind of critical thinking, what type of beaks would be best for eating larger seeds? Do we think large beaks or smaller beaks would be best for eating large seeds? What do we think? Anybody have an idea? Right. So the large beaks are going to be best for breaking up the large seeds, right? And then if we have small seeds, small soft seeds, okay, Are these going to be best for, or what size beak are going to be useful here for the small soft beaks or seeds? Right. So small beaks are going to be useful for the soft seeds. Exactly. So good job. So that's what we see. So the large beaks are going to be best for eating the very large, very hard seeds because they're larger. They're going to be more strong. Okay. The smaller beaks, they're going to be best for breaking up these small seeds. Okay. So when Peter and Rosemary Grant first got to the Galapagos Islands in 1976, they kind of took a study of all of the finches that were available to them. And so they counted a total of 751 finches in 1976. And one of the things that they were measuring for was the average beak depth, okay, the thickness of that beak. Okay. So in 1976, the average beak depth was about 9.5 millimeters in thickness. Okay. That's what they saw. Okay. Now what happened is the following year, in 1977, there was a huge drought. Okay. So this was a major drought that pretty much wiped out most of the vegetation on Daphne major. Okay. And so if most of the vegetation got destroyed, that's also going to limit and cause the number of seeds available to also decline. Okay. And so the number of seeds that were available, the food source that was available to these birds dropped significantly. Okay. And so most of these surviving plants produced very, very large seeds. Okay. So again, most of the vegetation died, but the plants that did survive were plants that produced very large, very hard seeds. Okay. So that being said, which finches do you think survived during this time, and which ones do you think died? Okay. Which is the finches with big beaks or the finches with small beaks? Okay. Which ones survived and which ones died off here? Right. So the large-beaked birds were the ones that lived, and the small-beaked birds were the ones that died. And so when they looked at the study, or when they looked at the amount of birds available in 1978, in the year after the drought, they found that the big-beaked birds were the ones that were able to survive. And that was evidenced by an increase in the average beak depth. Okay. So the amount of survivors, okay, typically had larger beaks, okay, than the ones that did not survive. Okay. So smaller beaked birds, smaller beaked finches ended up dying during this period because, well, we'll get to that in a sec. And the larger beaked birds were the ones that were able to survive. Okay, so actually, let me go ahead and ask you this question. So based off of our data here, why do we think we lost our small beaked birds? Okay, why is it that small beaked birds were not able to survive in this environment? So Kimberly says the small beaks couldn't crack the nuts. Yeah, right, exactly. The small beaked birds, okay, they couldn't utilize the resources that were available to them. In this case, that was the food. Okay, the food that was available were the large, very hard seeds. Okay, but the birds that had small beaks were not able to crack them open. Their beaks weren't strong enough. Okay, so if they're not able to eat, eventually they're gonna starve and they're gonna die. Okay, and so we end up losing those guys from the population. And the ones that are able to survive are going to be the larger beaked birds that obviously were able to utilize those resources, be able to break open those large, hard seeds. Exactly. Good. Okay, so that's exactly what we see here. So because the large hard seeds were pretty much the only available food source, the finches that had large beaks were the only ones that were actually able to eat. Okay, and so as a result, okay, the average beak size shifted, okay, and increased in the surviving population. Okay. The flip side of that was the beaks, or the finches that had small beaks. Their beaks were not strong enough to be able to open up those seeds, okay, and so they ended up starving and dying. Okay, so they did not survive nearly as well as the large beaked finches. Okay, so this is where we saw natural selection happen in just a 2-year period. Okay, from 1976 to 1978, we were the Peter and Rosemary Grant were actually able to see natural selection occur, okay, based off of a change in the environment. Okay. And so that's typically what's going to be happening. A change in the environment is going to lead to natural selection occurring, okay, which will eventually lead to evolution, and we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, everyone kind of following me so far? Yeah, okay. Cool. Perfect, perfect. All right, oops, sorry. Okay. So what we saw, so basically for this reason, because Peter and Rosemary Grant were able to find and actually see and observe natural selection in a 2-year period, okay, they're kind of considered kind of the heroes of evolutionary biology, because they were able to see something that typically happens over the course of several years, really in over the course of, you know, a year and a half to 2 years. Okay. So they're pretty dope. They're pretty dope. Okay, so that's the Grants. Okay, so basically what they were able to see is that beak size was an inherited trait. Okay, and so typically what happened is the large beak birds that were able to survive the drought also mated with other surviving, you know, large beaked finches. Okay, and so the offspring also ended up having large beaks. Okay, and so that also kind of helped to shift the average beak size, okay, to a higher number. Okay, from about 9.5 millimeters to a little over 10 millimeters in thickness. Okay. So large beak birds mated with other large beak birds and produced large beaked offspring. So that beak size was an inherited trait. And so this ultimately led to an evolution of beak size in the medium ground finch on Daphne major. And again, that was due to a changing environment. Okay. The environment changed, which caused the traits that were necessary for survival, okay, to change as well. That led to natural selection. And the natural selection will eventually lead to evolution. Okay. So when we think about evolution, okay, evolution is just considered a change in a population over time. Okay, so usually when we think of evolution, we think of, you know, like apes evolving into humans, and, you know, so and so, yada yada yada, evolving into something else. Okay. So that's kind of what we consider, what I consider the mainstream definition of evolution. Okay. When we're considering like a biological definition of evolution, in biology, we define evolution as just a change in a population over time. Okay. That change can be a physical change, it can be a genotypic change, it can be, you know, it could be any one of those things. Okay. As long as we see some change in the population over a period of time. Okay. So that's what we consider evolution, a change in the population over time, and that's usually going to be due to natural selection, and natural selection is going to be due to a change in the environment. Okay. Okay. So, like we said, natural selection will eventually lead to evolution. Okay. However, natural selection can only take place if there's variation in that population. Okay. Variation among the individuals in that population. Okay, what that means is that the individuals in that population have to be different from each other. They all have to have like different sets of traits from one another. Okay? So, for example, when we were looking at the finches before, okay, there is a variation in the beak sizes. Okay, some finches had large beaks, some had short beaks, some had medium beaks, and kind of everything in between. So there is a variation in the beak sizes. Okay, so natural selection depends on the variation within that particular trait. Okay, or within a set of traits. Okay. And again, that variation has to be due to genetics. It has to be something that is genetically inherited. Okay. So in order for us to get this genetic variation, this genetic diversity, genetic diversity is going to come from one of two places, or in some cases, both places. Okay. It can come from sexual reproduction, okay, typically when crossing over and independent assortment happen in meiosis, okay, or it can happen via mutations. And so we already kind of talked about crossing over independent assortment. We're not going to kind of beat that over your head too much anymore. But we are going to talk about mutations a little bit more. Okay. So mutations are just a change in the DNA. Okay. So when there's a change in the DNA from what it was initially supposed to be, that is what we consider a mutation. Okay. So mutations are sources of where we get new alleles, where we have one allele kind of mutating into something else. Or it can be just a new source of genetic variation within that population. Okay. So depending on the mutation can be good, can be bad, or it can be neutral. Okay. And so they can affect the phenotype in a way that reduces what's called the fitness. Okay. So fitness is not necessarily how strong that animal is or how strong the organism is. Fitness in a natural selection kind of evolutionary context means how well it's able to survive and reproduce. Okay, its likelihood of survival and reproduction. Okay. So some mutations can reduce fitness, can reduce the chances of survival and reproduction. some can improve fitness, and some may have no effect on fitness at all. Okay? So an example of a mutation that might reduce fitness might be, for example, a gazelle being born with 3 legs as opposed to 4. Okay? Well, if it's born with 3 legs, it's not going to be able to move as quickly, and so it's going to get picked off by predators fairly early on in its life. Okay? And so it's not going to have a chance to survive and reproduce and pass on that 3-leg gene to their offspring. Okay? So that's going to be a mutation that helps, or that causes a reduction in fitness. Okay? One that might improve fitness might be, let's see. So for there's some bacteria that might develop a mutation that protects them against certain types of antibiotics. Okay? There's one bacteria called MRSA, I forget what the M stands for, but something resistant, Staphylococcus aureus, some bacteria that's resistant to a particular bacteria. Okay? And again, that resistance is due to a mutation in its own genome. Okay? So that's a mutation that helps it to be able to survive and reproduce better by not being able to be killed by that particular antibacterial. Okay? So that's one that helps to improve fitness. Okay? Then there's other ones that don't have an effect on fitness, like for example, being born with red hair. Okay? So for example, being a redhead, that's not going to affect your ability to survive or reproduce. Okay? So that's one that's going to be more neutral. Yeah. So mutations can either reduce fitness, improve fitness, or have no effect on fitness. Okay? And these mutations can either lead to very small effects or very large substantial effects, or anything kind of in between. Okay, those are mutations. Okay, so when we're looking at how well an organism is going to be able to survive in a particular environment, we're going to be looking at that organism's adaptations. So an adaptation is a trait that gets inherited from a parent, and that trait improves an organism's fitness, okay, its ability to survive and reproduce. Okay. So that helps to kind of match that particular organism for the environment that it lives in. Okay? So for example, if we're going back to that Daphne major example, an adaptation for the environment after that drought was the large beaks on those finches. Okay? Having large beaks was an adaptation that allowed them to be able to best survive and reproduce in that particular environment. Okay? Whereas the small beaked ones, that was not an appropriate adaptation for that environment. Okay? So there's got to be a match between the environment that an organism lives in with the traits that that organism actually has. Okay? That's what an adaptation is. Okay? It's a trait that allows or improves an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. Okay? It improves their fitness. Okay? And so adaptations will typically develop whenever there's a change in the environment. Typically, like I said, with the change in the environment during the drought here. Okay. So changes in the environment will typically shift the genetic variation to one side or the other. And typically, like we said here, the trait here, the change in the environment here, led to a genetic variation, led to a change that caused the large-beaked birds to become more prevalent. Okay. Now, the thing about these traits and the things about adaptations is that they're considered favorable and unfavorable, but it's based on the environment in that particular period. Okay. So, for example, in this particular period, right after the drought, okay, the large-beaked finches, okay, having large beaks was an appropriate or a favorable adaptation, okay, a favorable trait. Okay. However, as we'll see in lab going this week, a few years after this drought at Daphne Major, there was a flood. There was an El Nino event that caused lots of flooding, and it caused now the small seeds to be more prevalent. Okay? And so as a result, the large-beaked birds, they were not able to break open the small seeds. So those ones were the ones that died now. Okay? So what was favorable in one environment, okay, now shifted. Okay, now became unfavorable in the next time period or the next environment. Okay. So a trait being favorable and unfavorable has to do with the environment at that particular period. Okay. If the environment changes, that can cause individual traits to now be shifted from being favorable to unfavorable, or vice versa. Okay. Does that make sense? questions? Yeah, okay. Okay, cool. All righty, so those are adaptations. Okay, before we go forward, are there any questions before we go forward here? Okay. Okay. So that's going to lead us into these patterns of evolution. And we'll talk about these a little bit today, and then we'll dive into them a little bit more so on Thursday. But essentially what evolution does is that evolution will show us variations in the form and the function, basically in the structure of some organism and its function kind of in that particular environment, or the form of a particular part of that organism and its function. Okay. So evolution causes variations in form and function, structure, as well as what it's able to do. Okay. And so there's different types of evolution. The first one that we consider is called divergent evolution. And so divergent evolution is where we have two species that evolve from a single common ancestor. Okay? So we have some common ancestor. Okay, it lived in one particular environment, and as the organisms of, the organisms of that species start to move to different areas, okay, they now occupy different environments. As they occupy different environments, the traits that are favorable are going to switch, are going to kind of adjust things. And then we end up with two different species that evolved from a single common ancestor. And so an example of this would be like flowers. Okay? So flowers have the overall kind of similar reproductive structures. Okay? They're all going to have pollen. They're all going to have a stigma, which contains the egg. And the pollen, which contains the sperm. So they're going to have the same overall structure. Okay? All flowers, regardless of what you're looking at, whether you're looking at a rose, sunflower, or either of these two flowers here, they're all going to have the same pretty much overall reproductive structures. Okay. However, and they're all going to be kind of basically looking the same. However, they're going to kind of look different. They're going to kind of have different traits and different functions based on the type of pollinator that's necessary to allow them to reproduce. Okay. So these flowers here at the top, these are guys are going to be mostly pollinated by the wind. So wind is going to be kind of carrying the pollen to allow this particular plant to eventually reproduce. Okay. So its colors don't need to be as bright, doesn't need to spend as much energy making bright colors, because it's just going to be pollinated by the wind. Okay. These flowers over here need to be pollinated by insects, be pollinated by bees and other moths and things like that. Okay. So in order to attract their pollinators, they need very bright colors, and so to attract that pollinator to come in, grab the pollen, and then take it elsewhere. Okay. So the reproductive organs are going to be structured the same, okay, but they're going to have some differences based in their kind of overall function in terms of their pollination to determine how they're going to be able to reproduce. Okay. So we have similar structure, okay, but slightly different function. Okay. And so these are what we refer to as homologous structures. Okay. So homologous structures are where we have similar structures that are going to evolve from a single common ancestor. So another example of kind of homologous structures would be if we're looking at like birds here. Okay. So here we've got two birds. We've got an ostrich and then we have a hummingbird. Okay. Both of these have feathers that will eventually kind of lead them to have wings. Okay. So the wings of a hummingbird allow it to be able to fly and hover and things like that and be able to move from point A to point B in the air. However, if we're looking at ostriches, okay, their wings are not going to allow them to fly. They're going to be built the same. They're going to be built both of feathers, okay? But they're going to differ in the function. In terms of hummingbirds, it's going to allow them to be able to fly. In the case of ostriches, the wings are going to be more for protection of its own body as well as the protection of its offspring. Okay. Same structure, different function. Okay, so that's what we call divergent evolution. They evolved from a single kind of bird ancestor. And then as they started to occupy different environments, they developed, individual traits that allow them to be able to survive best in that particular environment. Okay. The second type of evolution that we can have is called convergent evolution. Okay. So convergent evolution occurs when we have two individual separate species, okay, that evolve similar traits, okay, but they're not related to one another. So for example, here we have a bat which has wings, and then we have a butterfly that also has wings. Okay? So these are going to perform the same function, okay, but they're going to be built differently. Okay, they're going to be built differently because they're going to be inherited from different ancestors. They do not share a common ancestor, okay? So they're going to have structurally different elements, okay? But they're going to serve an overall similar function based, again, on sharing kind of a similar environment. Okay, so this is what we consider analogous structures, okay, where we start to form similar structures, okay, that have the same function, okay, but are built differently. Okay? So homologous structures have same function, or same structure, different function. Okay? Analogous structures, different structure, but the same overall function. Okay? And again, this is going to be due to independent evolution. They're going to be independently developing these traits from one another. Okay? Again, that's going to be through evolution, but based on their own environments, not because they're related, but because they share similarities in their environments. Okay. That's what we call convergent evolution. Okay. Any questions? And again, we'll talk more about that on Thursday. But are there any questions on divergent evolution and convergent evolution before we go forward? Okay. All right. So at this time, we've looked at Charles Darwin, who was looking at natural selection, which eventually led to evolution. We looked at Alfred Wallace, who also studied the same thing, okay, natural selection leading to evolution. Okay. But also around that same time period, Gregor Mendel, okay, our genetics guy, he was working on the pea plants. Okay. And so all three of these guys were all kind of related to one another without really knowing it. They were all kind of working on the same kind of overall phenomenon, okay, without even knowing that any of the other ones even existed, and that they were all kind of working on everything. Okay. So they all were kind of working about this about the same time, around the 1850s, when they all kind of published their own individual works, or 1860 or so. Okay. Gregor Mendel eventually finished around 1868 or so, if I remember correctly. Okay. His work kind of wasn't really embraced, and it wasn't really kind of looked at again until the early 1900s. Okay. Charles Darwin kind of proposed all these ideas, okay, but again, his wasn't really fully embraced again until the late 1890s and the early 1900s. Okay. Once people started to look at genetics and how genetics works, in terms of what Mendel was showing us, people were like, okay, Mendel's actually onto something. And then as people started to later on kind of connect genetics to how natural selection kind of plays into factor here, or plays into the picture here, they were actually saying, okay, Mendel, Darwin, and Wallace were all kind of interrelated here. Okay, you can't have genetics without natural selection, and you can't have natural selection that leads to evolution. All three of these kind of components here are all going to be very closely related. Okay, and they're going to be really tied together. Okay, and so when scientists really started to kind of connect genetics with evolution, that became what's called modern synthesis, and that didn't actually become a thing until 1940. Okay, so almost 100 years had passed before people actually started to realize genetics and evolution were actually intimately tied to one another. Okay, and so what we were able to see is that the evolutionary pressures, like natural selection, had an impact on population genetics as a whole. Okay, and how different populations are able to evolve into different individual species. Okay. When we're looking at modern synthesis, there was kind of two kind of sub divisions of evolution that were kind of determined. The first one was called microevolution, and that's just a gradual change in an individual population. So for example, if you're looking at a population of squirrels in Gilroy, for example, if you're looking at a change within squirrels in Gilroy, that would be considered microevolution. However, there's also macroevolution. Okay, so macroevolution is the type of evolution that leads to the development of new species with characteristics that have now kind of diverged from the original main species. Okay, so we have microevolution, which leads to just a change in the population. Macroevolution leads to the development of new species. Yeah, Paul, so you raised that hand.
So like when you're talking about the two different types, the convergent and divergent, like you were talking about
Mhm,
like the bat and like say like an insect, they both have wings. Like,
mhm.
don't most species actually have like a common ancestor at some point? And like how close in the branch does it have to be to like differentiate between those two types?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So Paul's question is basically, didn't pretty much every organism have a single common ancestor? That's the hypothesis. That's kind of the main hypothesis right now, is that there was a single individual common ancestor, like way, when the Earth was first created, and then eventually that common ancestor developed into a number of different organisms that eventually led to what all the variation species that we see today. That's the prevailing hypothesis, and there hasn't really been one that's kind of debunks it. But obviously, there's other theories as to what actually happened. Now, again, from a species standpoint, most species are related to some degree. They're all going to have a sharing in the DNA, or there's going to be similarities in their DNA sequences to some degree. Okay. However, it's difficult to know exactly how far back those connections go, and if those connections are actually true. And so one of the problems with kind of doing this is when we're looking at trying to identify what organisms are related to other ones, there are certain techniques that we can use, but it's not an exact science. And so, for example, we have no way of knowing for sure if a bat is actually related to a butterfly, to any degree, and to what degree it is, if so. Okay, so that's kind of where things get a little bit muddy. And this is not an exact science. This is all pretty much, I don't want to say guesswork, but it's a lot of hypothesis, a lot of hypothesizing, a lot of using different techniques to give you clues, and then you take those clues and kind of extrapolate data from there. But again, if those clues aren't right, then it kind of throws everything off, and it throws everything. So it's a lot more complicated than I'm making it, or that I'm kind of making it seem. I hope that answers your question. I know it's kind of I was all over the place, but
Well, I know
it's very, very complicated, and it's a lot of kind of guesswork. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool. So hopefully that makes sense. Any other questions here? That was a very good question. Okay. Okay. All righty. So that leads us into what population genetics is. Okay. So if you remember, kind of going back to chapter 9, or maybe it was chapter 8. I think it was chapter 8. Chapter 8. We were looking at chapter 8. When we're looking at different alleles and different genes, we remember something that we want to keep in mind is that each individual is going to have 2 alleles for a particular gene. Okay? Now, those 2 alleles may either be the same or they may be different depending on what your parents passed on to you. Okay? So each person is going to have 2 alleles for a given gene. However, in an overall population, okay, there may be more than just 2 alleles for that particular gene. Like, for example, if we're looking at hair color, there's blonde hair, there's black hair, there's brown hair, there's red hair. So there's multiple different alleles, usually more than just 2, okay, for a particular gene. Okay. So population genetics is the study of how all these allele frequencies will eventually lead to a change in a population, lead to evolution, using some selective forces. Okay. So in order for us to see evolution, and I think we're going to go ahead and kind of write this up here. In order for us to see evolution, the first thing that we need to do, actually, evolution, and the easiest way for us to be able to see evolution is by looking at a change in the phenotype. Okay. If we're able to see a difference, if we're able to see a physical change in the overall structures of a population, okay, we're going to be able to easily see evolution. Okay, we're able to see changes in the phenotypes, so we're going to easily know that evolution is taking place. Okay. Now, in order for us to see a change in the phenotype, what do we need to see a change in? Okay. We need to see a change in the genotype, because again, genotype determines phenotype. Okay. Okay. In order for us to be able to see a change in the genotype, we need to see changes in the alleles. Okay. So essentially what's going to be happening is, in order for us to see evolution, the easiest way for us to be able to see evolution is by looking at a change in the phenotype. Okay. In order to see a change in the phenotype, okay, phenotypes are going to be determined by genotypes. Okay. And then the genotype itself is going to be determined by alleles. Okay. So in order to see evolution kind of as a whole, this whole process is going to begin with changes in allele frequencies. Okay. If the number of alleles of a particular population changes, that's going to give you a change in the genotype frequencies, which is going to cause a change in the amount of phenotypes you're able to see, and then we're going to be able to see a change in evolution. Okay. So an example of this was if you take a look at the population in the Jordan, okay, specifically as it comes to the blood types. Okay. So in that particular population, the IA allele is found in 26.1% of the population. The IB allele is found in about 13.4% of the population. And the little I allele, okay, which codes for the kind of O blood type, is found in about 60.5% of the population. Okay. So when we're looking for allele frequencies, typically what you do is you find the number of that given allele in the population, and you divide it by the total number of alleles in that particular population. Okay. So if we're looking for the A allele, we're going to find all of the A alleles, okay, the number of all the A alleles, okay, then divide that by the total number of alleles in that population, and that'll give us the frequency, in this case, 26.1%. Okay. Now, all the allele frequencies need to add up to 100%, which makes sense because you have to account for all the alleles in your population. Okay. Now, when you see a change in these frequencies, that is going to indicate that we have evolution occurring. Okay. If we have a change in the alleles, that's going to cause us to have a change in the genotypes. If you have a change in the genotypes, it's going to give us a change in the phenotypes. And if we have a change in the phenotype, we're going to be able to visually observe evolution occurring in our population. Okay. Does this make sense? Yeah, okay. All right, cool. All right, so that's typically how population genetics will be working here. Okay, one of the things that we're going to be really paying attention to is the allele frequencies in the population. Okay, so that being said, natural selection has the ability to alter your gene frequencies, or sorry, your allele frequencies. Okay. So we're going to take this from a couple perspectives here. So, for example, if we have an allele, okay, that allele that might result in a phenotype that allows an individual to survive and reproduce and have more offspring, okay, that allele is going to be found more and more often in the generations to come. Okay. It's going to be found in more so in the offspring, and then it's going to be, obviously propagated from generation to generation, and it's going to increase in frequency. Okay. That allele is going to increase in frequency. Okay. So if we have a scenario, okay, where the frequency of that allele increases, okay, then the frequency of all the other alleles has to decrease. Okay, because you have to account for 100%. Okay, so for example, let's say we have 60% of one particular allele. Let's say we're looking at rabbits and fur color. Let's say there's 60% of rabbits have the brown fur color allele. The other 40% have everything else. Okay, if that brown fur color increases in frequency, let's say it jumps up to 80%, okay, then everything else now has to come down to about 20%. Okay, so the allele frequencies are going to shift. When one allele increases, that's going to lead to another allele frequency decreasing in frequency. Okay? Because again, you have to add up to 100%. Okay? So when the frequency of one allele increases, the frequency of all the other alleles has to decrease. Okay? Now, if we're looking at an allele that is very, very beneficial or highly beneficial for survival and reproduction, if that allele becomes what we consider to be fixed, meaning that it's going to be found in every single individual in that population. Okay? So an example of a fixed allele or a fixed gene or a fixed allele might be like having two eyes, right? So having two eyes would be something that's highly beneficial. Okay, every human is going to have two eyes. Okay? That is going to be able to allow you to be able to survive. okay? Because, you know, if you're able to have two eyes, you can see what's going on in your surroundings and escape from danger better, okay? And it's gonna allow you to reproduce because no one really wants to mate with a cyclops, right? If you only got one eye, you know, the ladies aren't really gonna be digging that too much, right? Okay, so that's gonna allow for survival and reproduction. Okay? That's gonna be what we consider a fixed gene, okay? Or a fixed allele, okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Alleles that are highly beneficial for survival and reproduction are gonna be what we consider fixed, which means that every individual is going to have that particular allele. Okay? Every individual in that population will have that allele. Okay. All right, does that make sense as far as the beneficial traits or beneficial alleles? Yeah, okay. Okay. Now the flip side of this is if we're looking at some detrimental alleles, okay, alleles that inhibit your ability to survive and reproduce, those ones are going to get removed from the gene pool altogether. Okay? So the gene pool is kind of the sum of, or the collection of all of the alleles in the population. Okay? So again, for example, if we kind of go back to an example of a gazelle having only 3 legs, that's going to be a detrimental allele. That's going to affect ability to survive and reproduce. Okay? And so what's going to be happening is if we have a gazelle that's born with 3 legs, okay, it's going to try to, you know, keep it up with, you know, as it kind of grows older and older, but it's going to get picked up by a predator pretty early on because it's not going to be able to move that easily. Okay? So if it gets picked off early in life, it's going to die before it even has a chance to reproduce and pass on that 3-legged gene to its offspring, or the 3-legged allele to its offspring. Okay? So that's what we mean by detrimental alleles are going to get quickly removed from the gene pool. Okay? They're going to inhibit your ability to survive. And if you're not able to survive to a reproductive age, you're not going to be able to pass on that allele because you're not having babies, because you died before you had a chance to have babies. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So detrimental alleles are going to be removed from the gene pool altogether, okay, by these selective forces. Okay. Typically by natural selection. Okay. So in order for us to fully understand how alleles are going to be able to change, or allele frequencies can change, we first need to understand all these different selective forces. Okay? So selective forces are just changes in the environment that cause natural selection to occur in some form or fashion. Okay? Okay. So those selective forces are going to, you know, result in a change in the environment. That change in the environment is going to lead to natural selection, and that's going to cause some individuals to survive better in response to the resulting environment than others. Okay. Okay. So an example of some kind of selective forces here are the peppered moths that we kind of brought up at the beginning of the semester. Okay? So just kind of recap here. Back before the Industrial Revolution in England or in the UK, there was 2 variations of the British peppered moth. Okay? There was one that kind of looked kind of salt and pepper like, and then there was one that was black. Okay? Now, in this environment before the Industrial Revolution, these peppered moths would kind of inhabit these areas or these trees or lichen plants. They were also kind of black and white as well. Okay, so these guys were pretty well able to kind of blend into their environment, and whereas the black peppered moths were not able to. Okay, they weren't able to blend in, and so as a result, those ones were getting picked off and killed pretty frequently by predators. Okay? While the salt and pepper looking guys, okay, these kind of peppered moths here, those were the ones that were able to survive better because they were able to blend in with the environment. They survived better, and as a result, they were able to reproduce a lot better. Okay. However, once the Industrial Revolution happened, the factories that started getting produced started to release lots of ash and lots of soot and lots of debris that would start to cover up these plants or cover up these trees. And so we had all these ash-covered trees that looked very dark. And so now, our black peppered moths, okay, became more prevalent. Okay, they became better able to survive because they were able to blend into their environment better. Okay? So they were able to survive a lot better and eventually reproduce, while now the salt and pepper moths, okay, those ones were not able to blend in with the environment, and they were getting killed by their predators. Okay? So this is kind of another example of where a trait that was favorable at one time is no longer favorable at another time. Okay? Initially, okay, looking kind of this salt and pepper color was favorable, but after the Industrial Revolution happened, now it became an unfavorable trait. Okay, before being black was unfavorable. Now after the Industrial Revolution, the black moths became, or having the black color became favorable here. Okay, and so the population was able to change over a period of time. The initial population had mostly the salt and pepper moths, with a handful of these black ones because they were getting killed by predators and they weren't able to survive and reproduce that well. Okay. After the Industrial Revolution, okay, the black ones were able to survive a lot better, and so the black alleles started to become a lot more prevalent in the population than the salt and pepper alleles. Okay. They were not able to survive as well. Okay. Okay. That's just kind of an example there. Any questions before we get into this kind of next kind of big topic here? Any questions on how population genetics works or what the goal of it is? Okay. Okay, so that is going to bring us to a study or a principle called Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay? So in the early 1900s, there was a mathematician named Godfrey Hardy, and then a physician, a doctor named Wilhelm Weinberg. And so these two guys, again, kind of working independently, which is kind of interesting here, in that they were trying to figure out how is it that different species can develop different traits. And one of the major questions that Hardy kind of ran into was, how is it that dominant alleles, dominant traits, don't just kind of run to 100%? Why are dominant traits not found in every single organism, and recessive traits continue to persist in the population? Okay, why does that happen? Okay, well, what he determined was that in order for us to see changes in the allele frequencies, there has to be something that's affecting that particular allele frequency. There's got to be some force at work kind of adjusting those allele frequencies. And so what he found is that if there's no factors that are affecting your allele frequencies, if there's nothing that's going to affect your allele frequencies, then those frequencies should remain constant from generation to generation, okay, which makes sense, right? If there's no change, we shouldn't see a change. Okay? If there's nothing that's affecting the allele frequencies, we shouldn't see a change in the allele frequency. Okay. And so that led to Hardy and Weinberg both, again, coming up to the same conclusion at about the same time, completely independently of each other, and what we consider a phenomenon now known as the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay. So what Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium tells us is that allele frequencies and genotype frequencies are going to be stable over time unless there is some evolutionary force that acts on that population. Okay. Unless there's some evolutionary force that's acting, okay, all those allele and genotype frequencies should stay constant from generation to generation to generation to generation. Okay. And that is going to be the case whether we're looking at dominant alleles or recessive alleles. Okay. So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium tells us what will be happening assuming there is no evolution. Okay. Okay. So, however, Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, it can be violated or can be disrupted by any one of these 5 evolutionary forces. Okay. So those 5 evolutionary forces that can eventually lead to changes in the allele frequency are natural selection, mutation, genetic drift, migration, and non-random mating. And we'll kind of go through these here. Okay. So those are the 5 forces that can disrupt Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay. The first one is natural selection. I'm not going to beat you guys over the head with that too much. We've already kind of talked about that already. The second one is mutations. Okay, so mutations can alter the allele frequencies, okay, because you're literally creating one allele out of another. Okay? So you're basically going to be adding an extra allele, and if you add an allele frequency, okay, that's going to cause, again, the other allele frequencies to shift. Okay? So allele frequencies are going to change in very small, very gradual amounts if we introduce a mutation into the population. Okay? Now, if there are no forces acting on that mutation, if there's no evolutionary forces acting on that mutation, or natural selection doesn't affect that mutation whatsoever, then that mutation is going to be more found with more frequency from generation to generation. Okay? So that allele frequency is going to increase over time, okay, from generation to generation. Okay? However, if natural selection acts against that mutation, let's say that mutation is detrimental to survival, then that allele, that mutant allele frequency is then going to decline out of that population, okay? Which again makes sense, right? If you have an allele that pops up and that allele is not able to help you survive or reproduce, that allele is going to end up getting removed, okay? But if that allele doesn't affect your ability to survive or reproduce, then that allele would become more prevalent and more prevalent and more prevalent from generation to generation. Okay. And again, that's going to shift the other allele, the other already existing allele frequencies. Okay. And that will ultimately lead to evolution. Okay. That's mutations. The third one is genetic drift. So genetic drift are these random changes in the allele frequencies, but this is going to be much more prevalent when, or much more profound when the populations that you're looking at are small. And we'll take a look at this in a little bit. Okay? So genetic drift is just random changes in the allele frequency. Okay? We'll talk about that more. We'll kind of get into that in a little more detail later. Okay? So that one's just based off of random chance. Number 4 is migrations. Okay? And so migrations occur when individuals either move into a population or move out of a population. Okay, so for example, here we've got a population of green beetles. Here we have a population of brown beetles. So if we have a brown beetle moving from one population into the green beetle population, okay, now we're introducing the brown allele into this new population here. And again, that's going to cause the allele frequencies to now shift. Instead of having like 100% green alleles, now we might have like 85% or so green alleles and 50% brown alleles. Okay? So allele frequencies are going to shift as you introduce new alleles into a population or out of a population. Okay? And then the last one is called non-random mating. So non-random mating is where you have individuals that only mate with other ones that are like them, okay, or individuals that are not like them. Okay. So for example, if we had brown allele or brown beetles only mating with brown beetles, or green beetles only mating with green beetles, okay, there's an intentionality in who they're mating with, okay, then that would be considered non-random mating because they're only mating with things that look like them, okay. Or if they only mate with things that don't look like them, okay. So for example, let's say we had a brown beetle only mating with green beetles, and they only mate with beetles of the opposite color. Okay, that would be considered non-random mating because there's an intentionality in who they're mating with. Okay. Now, non-random mating is a little bit different from the previous 4 in that it does not affect your allele frequencies, but it does affect the genotype frequencies. Okay. And so it does not cause, it doesn't directly cause evolution, but it does, eventually lead to evolution. Okay. So those are the 5 components that can lead to evolution, okay? The things that can violate and disrupt Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay. So here's the kicker. So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium tells us what will be happening assuming that no evolution takes place. The thing, though, is that every population has at least one of those 5 disruptions happening. Okay, either natural selection is occurring, migration, genetic drift, mutations, or non-random mating. Okay. Every population has at least one of those happening. So evolution is always occurring in any population. Okay. So if that's the case, why even talk about Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium at all? Okay. Well, why is Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium even important if we know it's not true, okay, if it doesn't actually happen? Well, basically the reason we have Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is when we do some calculations that are through this principle, it gives us like a baseline, okay? A baseline for what we should see, assuming no evolution is occurring. Okay, so for example, if we are using Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and we say that, okay, based off of our population here, 50% of humans should have black hair and 50% of people should have blonde hair, okay, based off of the mathematical calculations we get using Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay? Well, if we actually go out into the population and we start looking at individual people, okay, then we're going to see, okay, wait, no, there's about 20% of people who have black hair, maybe 30% of people who have blonde hair, 40% of people who have brown hair, and then 10% of people who have black hair. If those numbers that you get, if the theoretical numbers you get from Hardy-Weinberg are different from what you're actually seeing and observing in the population, that tells you evolution is actually taking place. Okay. So If the numbers that you get from actually looking in the population versus what you look at using Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, if they're deviating from one another, that tells you evolution is occurring. And then from there, as a scientist or the biologist, or you can then kind of piece apart which evolutionary force you think is at play, okay? Or which forces are at play. Okay? Does that make sense? And we'll take a look at this in more detail in lab this week too. But does this make sense here? Any questions? Okay, cool. So you're basically comparing the numbers you would calculate from Hardy-Weinberg from what you're actually seeing in the population. If those numbers are different, okay, that tells you evolution is taking place, and then from there you can try to figure out what force is actually at work by doing more kind of biology lab work, I guess. Okay. All right. So there's one type, or there's a couple types of non-random mating, or types of different types of sexual selection that can also play a role in terms of evolution as well, okay, or natural selection. And so sexual selection basically tells us, or basically is an individual's ability to mate and produce offspring, okay, based on certain traits that it has. Okay. However, the traits that are responsible for sexual selection could possibly be detrimental for survival. Okay. So basically what sexual selection is we're looking at double-edged swords, okay, where you have a trait that allows you to be able to reproduce better, okay, but that trait may also make it harder for you to survive. Okay. And so I'll show you a couple of examples of this, but this is where the two main types of sexual selection are, where we have male-male competition, okay, or female selection of mates. Okay. And the reason these traits continue to exist is because they dramatically increase reproductive success. Okay. So a couple of examples here. So the first one we're going to be taking a look at is called male-male competition. And so this is typically where males will be able to fight for territory. Okay. One of the kind of biggest examples of male-male competitions is with the elephant seals. Okay. So elephant seals around mating season are pretty much going to be fighting with one another, specifically the male elephant seals. Okay. They fight with each other, and the winner will have access to all of the females in that particular territory. Okay. So what these guys will do is they'll fight, and they'll fight. They'll pretty much bloody each other up. They'll do significant damage to each other. Okay. And the winner of this fight will be able to mate with all the females at once in that particular environment. Okay. So this is helpful for reproduction, because the winner is going to be able to reproduce with 5, 10, 15 females. Okay. However, it's also very detrimental because the loser can die in the process, and if they don't die, they can get significantly injured. Okay. And then the winner can also be significantly injured in the process as well. Okay. So it affects their ability to survive because they're pretty much darn near killing each other. Okay. But the winner has a chance to reproduce pretty much as much as it wants. Okay. So it affects survival, but it does have the ability to dramatically increase reproductive success. Okay. The second type of sexual selection is what we consider female selection. And so female selection is where females of a particular species are going to prefer specific traits in their males. Okay. So for example, if you look at the peacock, okay, male peacocks need to have very, very bright feathers. Okay. They have very, very bright feathers, and those bright feathers are going to be able to attract females to them. Okay. So females like the males that have very bright feathers. The problem with having very bright feathers is that very bright feathers are they're basically showing you off to all the predators. Okay, you're bright enough for the predators to be able to see you, and then predators can then kill you. Okay, so double-edged sword. Okay, it affects your ability to survive because now you're basically showing yourself off to the predators, but you're also showing yourself off to all the females around and attracting females to you, okay, so you can eventually reproduce. Okay, so these traits can become enhanced over time and kind of become more dramatic over time, but again, the goal is to help increase your reproductive success. Okay. But it can affect your ability to survive. Okay. All right, so that's sexual selection. Okay, that's pretty much it for chapter 11.1. Any questions on anything we've talked about so far? All right, so then we're going to kind of start on the mechanisms of evolution here. Before we go forward here, a couple questions. So first one, so which of the following is true about natural selection and evolution? A, natural selection acts on individuals and evolution acts on populations. B, natural selection acts on populations and evolution acts on individuals. C, natural selection and evolution both act on individuals. Or D, they both act on populations. Which one is true? So yes, he says B, Kimberly says A, Jackie says A, and the answer, Mario says A too, and the answer is indeed A. Right, so natural selection acts on individuals, and individuals are gonna be subject to natural selection. Okay. Well, evolution will act on populations. Evolution is gonna change the population structure. Okay. B is not correct because individuals are not going to evolve. Individuals do not evolve over their lifespan. They're just going to grow and develop. The change that you see in individuals is just going to be, programmed development. That's not going to be evolution. Okay, good. Okay, next question. So what is the purpose of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium? A, to determine what allele frequencies should be in a population if evolution is taking place, or to determine what evolution or what allele frequencies should be if no evolution is occurring. Which one is accurate of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium? Yes, everyone's saying B, good job, and B is exactly right. So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium tells us what allele frequency should be if there is no evolution taking place. Okay. If we actually go out into the population and we see that there's a difference, then we know that Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium has been violated, and then we can then try to figure out what evolutionary force is at work. Perfect. Good. All right, cool. So remember, Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is going to be affected, okay, by kind of one of four, five if you consider non-random mating, but typically one of four processes. Okay? Natural selection, mutations, genetic drift, and then migration. Okay? And again, if any one of those if none of these factors is at play, the allele frequencies should be constant. If at least one of those is at play, allele frequencies are going to change. Okay? And again, all populations are going to experience at least one of these four factors. Okay? So we're going to kind of go through some of these mechanisms of evolution and kind of go through them kind of piece by piece here. And then I guess we'll finish this up on Thursday. Yeah. Okay. But before we get there, quick question. So if an individual has an allele that confers an advantage for survival and reproduction, what will happen with this trait? A, the allele frequency will decrease in the population over time. B, the allele frequency will increase in the population over time. C, the allele frequency will remain the same in the population over time. Or D, you can't tell. If we have an allele that confers an advantage, okay, what do we think will happen? Yes, B is correct, right? So if the allele gives us an advantage, that's going to allow you to be able to survive and reproduce better. And so as a result, that particular trait, that particular allele is going to be found with more prevalence in the upcoming generations. Perfect. Okay, good. Okay, so we're going to start by taking a look at natural selection in a little more detail. And so natural selection is a process that's going to allow advantageous alleles to survive better. Okay, advantageous alleles are going to allow an individual to have a phenotype that allows it to survive better and eventually reproduce. Okay? Again, that's the key. It's not enough to just survive, but you also have to be able to reproduce and then pass on that allele to the future generations. Okay? So individuals with advantageous alleles are going to end up having more offspring than individuals that don't have those advantageous alleles. Okay? And so it'll be found with more prevalence in the upcoming generations as they continue to inherit that advantageous allele, and that allele increases in frequency. Okay? Typically what we've already seen so far. Okay? Nothing new here. All right, so that's natural selection. That's number one. That's the first factor that can lead to evolution. The second one is mutations. Okay, so mutations, like we saw before, are these just sources of new alleles? Okay? And they can also be sources of genetic variation as well. Okay? And so this is where we create one allele, okay, out of a pre-existing allele. Okay, we change the DNA sequence of one, and by changing the DNA sequence of one gene, you completely form that allele into something else. Okay. So you change one allele into another, and again, that's going to cause a small change in the allele frequency. Okay. Now, based on that particular mutation, that mutation can either be selected for, meaning that mutation is advantageous. Okay. It can be selected against, meaning that mutation is disadvantageous or detrimental. Okay. Or that mutation can be neutral, okay, meaning that it doesn't affect your fitness one way or the other. Okay. So when we look at beneficial mutations are going to be mutations that are going to spread throughout the generation or spread throughout multiple generations and slowly. Okay, it'll slowly start to increase in frequency from generation to generation. And again, those beneficial mutations are mutations that allow an individual to survive and reproduce, survive to sexual maturity, and then eventually be able to reproduce. Okay. Harmful mutations, on the other hand, are going to get eliminated from the gene pool. Okay. So any mutations that prevent you from being able to survive or prevent you from being able to reproducing, or both, are going to get eliminated from the gene pool altogether. Because again, you're not going to be able to reproduce. If you're not able to reproduce, you're not going to be able to pass on that harmful mutation. Okay, those are mutations. Okay, the third one is genetic drift. Okay, so genetic drift is just the effect that random chance has on allele frequencies over a period of time. Okay? And so the genetic drift tends to be much more potent when you're looking at a population that is small compared to one that is large. And I'll give you an example in a second. Okay? And so the allele frequencies may or may not make it into the population just due to random chance, either because you have individuals that die, okay, this is the mortality of the individuals. It could be due to an ability or an inability to find a mate just by random chance again. Or it could be due to the particular genome inside the gametes, the sperm and the egg, during fertilization. Okay. So here's an example here. Okay. So in genetic drift, here we've got an example. We've got 10 frogs. Okay. 3 of our frogs are brown. Okay. 7 of our frogs are green. Okay. So 30% of our frogs are brown, the other 70% are green. Okay. Now, in our population of 10 frogs, let's say 3 frogs die, and let's say those 3 frogs that die happen to all be brown, okay, just by random chance. Okay. Well, then the frogs in the resulting population will now be 100% green. Okay. There's going to be 100% green frogs and then 0% brown frogs. Okay. So we saw a very dramatic shift in the allele frequencies. Okay. We went from having 30% brown frogs to 0%, and then 70% green frogs to 100%. Okay. So a pretty dramatic shift in the allele frequencies. Okay. So this is what we mean that it's more pronounced in small populations. Okay. Now let's take a look at a large population and see what happens. So let's take a look and see what happens if we had a population that initially started as 100 frogs. Okay. Let's say we got 100 frogs. Again, we have the same proportions, 30% brown frogs and then 70% green frogs. Okay. And let's just say we lose 3 of our brown frogs again. Okay. Just like before. Okay. 3 brown frogs died in the first generation. Let's say 3 brown frogs die again here. If we lose 3 brown frogs, that's going to result in us having a population that now contains 27 brown frogs out of a total of 97 frogs altogether. Okay. And so as a result, we end up with 28% brown frogs. Okay. We went from having 30% brown frogs in the initial population to, after having genetic drift occur, now we have 28%. So a very small change in the allele frequencies, and then going from 70 to 72% green frogs. Okay. So that's what we mean when we see that genetic drift is much more pronounced in smaller generations or smaller populations than it is in larger populations. Okay. This is kind of a similar kind of thing here. So this just shows us what happens if we're looking at a small population. If we're looking at a small population like we see in graph A, the allele frequencies are going to increase, okay? Or one allele, I should say, is going to end up getting fixed, okay? Meaning that it's going to be found in 100% of the population, and then the other remaining alleles are all going to be eliminated, meaning that they're going to be found in 0% of the population. Okay? So that's going to be what happens in small populations. One allele eventually becomes fixed, the other ones get eliminated. Okay? The flip side of this is if we're looking at a large population, because there's so many individuals, okay, alleles typically are not going to get fixed or eliminated. Okay? And that's going to be assuming your population size is stable. Okay. This is kind of the same thing. I'll just kind of skip over this, and then we'll pick up here on Thursday. Okay. So we'll kind of call it for today. We'll finish up with genetic drift today, and then we'll kind of talk about the rest of the material. We'll finish up chapter 11 on Thursday. Okay. Any questions on anything we've covered so far today? Okay, so if there's no questions, you guys are free to go. I will publish the classwork in the next few minutes, so that will be available for you. And then if I will see you in lab later today, I'll see you in lab. If not, I will see you guys again on Thursday. Okay, all right, so that's that. All right, cool. So everyone, have a good one. Enjoy your day. Like I said, I'll put up the classwork in a second, and that'll be ready for you later today.